Do you think Israel's being scapegoated?
No, it's not being scapegoated. Israel is the goat. Israel is the target. Israel has always been the target since the day it was formed. Israel is, to this way of thinking, anathema. You may know the word Nakba, which is an Arabic word meaning catastrophe. This is how it is called in the Arab and the Muslim world. The creation of the State of Israel was a Nakba for the Arab people, for the Muslim people. Part of the reason has to do with the fact that throughout history, meaning 1400 years of the Islamic Jihad, since the foundation of the faith of Islam, the Jews have been dhimmis. Dhimmis are second-class citizens. They are the conquered ones. They are the ones who must live at the mercy of the dominant civilization that conquered them. And of course, Islam conquered all of the region of the Middle East, including the Levant. So when former dhimmis, like Jews, come to reinstate their ancestral homeland in a formal state of Israel, in their ancestral homeland, these are dhimmis now with a nation state of their own. And that, to them, is an abomination. This cannot stand. And there's a concept called Waqf. Waqf means endowed land, or land given by Allah to the Muslim people. Any land once conquered by Islam is forever Waqf. And even if it is lost, as Andalusia was, the Iberian Peninsula was, it must be gotten back again. Just as India must be gotten back again. You wonder about the attacks in Mumbai. India used to be Muslim empire, Muslim conquered territory. The same thing with the Levant, and the same thing with a piece of land, the teeny piece of land that Israel, the state of Israel, occupies now. So it's always been about Jews, and it's always been about that piece of land which was Waqf, was belonging to Islam, and now is no longer.
But do you think the Muslim world is using Israel as a scapegoat to unify and distract from their own foibles?
Honestly, I don't. No, I think Israel is very much front and center for them. I don't think that they're exaggerating it. I don't think that they're scapegoating it. This is the issue for the Islamic world. It really and truly is.
But would the establishment of a Palestinian state then resolve that issue?
No, it would not. It might solve the issue of that teeny tiny piece of land we talked about called the State of Israel today and the West Bank and Gaza. It might settle that. But it would not solve all the other Waqf, all the other land that used to be under Islamic domination and no longer is. They would simply move on to another place that is in dispute.
Europe?
Such as India or such as Andalusia.
Which is Spain? Which
is Spain and Portugal. Parts of Spain, parts of Portugal. As well, of course, Islamic conquest moved all the way up, as we all know, into Central Europe in its time. I mean, the gates of Vienna were being defended against the Ottoman Turks as late as 1683, which was the latest, farthest incursion they made. So if you want to think about it, all of the lands of the Balkans, all of the lands of southern and southeastern Europe in particular, the lands that are now countries of Bulgaria and Romania and Macedonia and so forth, Greece, were part of the Ottoman Empire at one point, part of Muslim lands. So yes, solving the Arab-Israeli problem is worthwhile in its own right. It deserves to be settled. It needs to be settled. In its own right, it stands alone as a worthwhile objective. But don't think that doing that is going to solve jihad, because it won't.
Do you think the United States is in their sights?
Yes, the United States very definitely is in the sights of Islamic jihad. And the reason that we know that, for instance, comes to light in the recently concluded second trial of the Holy Land Foundation, which, as we know, was a trial held first in 2007, later in 2008, at which time they obtained, at the end of November last year, 108 unanimous counts guilty as charged, terrorist funding to Hamas. Now, among the documents that came to light in that trial are a number of documents of the Muslim Brotherhood. And among those documents are statements, very frank statements, if you will, that describe exactly what the Ikhwan, or the Muslim Brotherhood, intend for the United States. And they say, quoting loosely more or less, they say, we, the Ikhwan, we will sabotage your miserable house with our hands from within. In other words, their intention is to bring Islam to the United States, to bring down our Constitution and substitute it with Sharia. Now, do I think that's going to happen overnight? No, I don't. But they are making inroads every place they can. One example is among our textbooks that are used in our schools, in our children's high schools, for instance. The history textbooks are full of inaccuracies, bias, and error in favor of Islam, biased against Judaism or Christianity. Another place is obviously in workplaces where majority workforces, or even not majority, sometimes they're minorities, agitate for special privileges, special time off, break time for prayer services, let's say, or special privileges of holidays, that they would be able to observe Muslim holidays in place of traditional American holidays such as Labor Day, for instance. Places like our universities where not only are Muslim organizations, Muslim Brotherhood Front organizations like the Muslim Student Association bringing radical speakers and imams to the campus to talk, but they're also instituting things like having women-only gym hours and closing gyms down for certain hours when men are not allowed there. Harvard University is an example of a place where that has happened recently. So in many ways like this, they're incremental, small, you may think, at the moment, step by step, but this is what's occurring.
And what's motivated you to become so involved in this issue?
Well, I think probably like a lot of people, 9/11 had a big influence on me. I began my career really focused on a whole other area of the world during the Cold War, during the 1980s and into the 90s on the Soviet Union and Russia, and that was my focus then. But really, after 9/11, I think like a lot of people, my attention turned to the Middle East, to Islam and issues regarding jihad. And I've done a great deal of study since then about it, learned from many of the wonderful people that we had here with us tonight. They've been my mentors and teachers, and I'm still learning. But what I do see is some continuity. When I was working against totalitarian ideology called communism, there are similarities between fighting that ideology and fighting this totalitarian ideology of Islamic supremacism, as Jeffrey Im puts it. It is the same kind of domination that is being sought. A domination not only over one's own faithful or believers or followers, but to impose that on everybody else in the world. And I'm an American, I object to that. Because not only are these organizations and groups advocating a particular position, but they now have the primary spokesman for those positions, which are inimical, as I say, to American national security policy. Those spokespeople are now moving into the government, as in the case of Ambassador Freeman, as in the case, another one is Dr. Vali Nasser, who has just been appointed a senior advisor to Ambassador Holbrooke for policies related to Afghanistan and Pakistan, both of which border Iran. And so you not only have now the organizations of these different groups advocating for this kind of policy, you have their very spokesman being appointed into the administration. That, to me, is a very successful influence operation.
And what's the source of this influence?
The influence is coming from those who are opposed to our national security interests, in my opinion. When you advocate a position for negotiations immediately with Iran, no preconditions, when you are willing to turn a blind eye to their nuclear weapons program, to their human rights abuses, to their support for terrorism, to their opposition to the peace process in the Middle East between Arabs and Israelis, when you have that kind of a policy position being urged and being seriously considered by the administration, as we see it happening right now, and the primary spokespeople for those positions being appointed to extremely high-level and influential positions within the government, then I think you have good reason for concern.
How is it making it up through the Obama administration in so short a time?
I think it's not been a short period of time. As I write in the paper, which was published by the Center for Security Policy just this past week, this effort at promoting influence, advocating these positions has been going on now for at least 5 to 10 years. In terms of Iran specifically is what the paper is about, so I'm speaking to that issue particularly. If you're going to talk about Saudi Arabia influence, and that would be the Sunni side of things, obviously that influence has been going on since the oil money started pouring in back in the 1970s. And what did they do with that oil money? They exported their influence through building of mosques, through publications, through staffing of mosques with their preachers and imams, and as well they endowed American universities. They bought shares in Middle East studies programs at our top Ivy League universities. And when you have that kind of influence coming in, there are strings attached. So I would argue to you that the graduates of the top programs in these universities in the United States, the Ivy League schools, the graduates of Harvard and Yale and Stanford and so forth, where do they go when they graduate? They go into the government. They go into the Department of State. They go into the intelligence community. They also go into the think tank community and the NGO community. And that's been going on now for 30, 35 years or more. And so when you say, how did this happen so quickly? It didn't happen quickly. This has been going on, planned and funded carefully for many, many decades. And on the Iranian or the Shia side, that operation has been going on, I would say, at least since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. But it really kicked into high gear more recently, and I would say probably from around the late 90s to the present time. It really shifted into a higher gear. And that's when they started forming organizations that are think tanks or NGOs, beginning with organizations like the American Iranian Council, headed up by Hushang Amir-Ahmadi, for instance. And then there are many more newer organizations, which you'll see in the paper, which came along much more recently in the time period even since 2000, 2005, 2007, 2008. These new organizations are sprouting like mushrooms around Washington, D.C. And if you look at them, you'll see their boards of directors are interchangeable and interlocking, which is to be expected when you have an interest group with the same ideas. But the problem is not that they're an influence group or that they're pushing a particular policy. The problem is that that policy coincides with the favored policy of the regime in Tehran, and that is on the State Department's list of state sponsors of terror, the number one top position ever since the list has been kept. That's the problem. It's my position that I write in the paper, the Iran Lobby, that an effort to influence not just this administration, but every administration going back to the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and throughout these decades, the effort to influence American foreign policy. It's strong, it's very well funded, much of the funding comes from Saudi Arabia. It's an influence operation. To do that, what do? They form NGOs, they form think tanks, they sit and serve on each other's boards of directors, they swap positions, they write papers for each other that go posted up on each other's websites, and they share some of the same funding sources. And this influence operation has been aimed at influencing United States government and its policies towards the Middle East for many, many decades. And it's very troubling in my opinion because it's so well funded and because it's inimical, in my opinion, to American national security interests. There's nothing wrong with lobby groups, you know, who want to advocate for their position. But when the money and the backing comes from regimes such as Saudi Arabia's or Tehran's that are fundamentally opposed to American national security objectives, then that's a problem.